All right, all right, all right. Well, look at there. How many people we got here so far? About 15 folks. Okay, good, good, good. So did everybody read the new purchase agreement?
Yep.
Oh, Crystal, which Crystal is that? Crystal Latimer, which Crystal is that?
Yeah, Crystal Latimer.
Hi, Crystal. Yeah, you would read it. You're such a geek. I love it. Good
I've
for
had to
you.
use it. I've had to use it 4 times already in
Well,
at least writing offers.
well, I give you stroke then, man. If you've had to use it 4 times, you can teach this baby instead of me. I love it.
I probably have
All
lots
right.
of questions.
Okay, well, we're going to go to the questions toward the end of the class because the next few pages, it doesn't take quite as much as the front ones. And, it was interesting today because I've gotten calls from a couple. Well, I got a call from a broker this morning when we get talking about earnest money again. And I actually got called from a title company today asking me questions about the 2-day notice form, the 2112, that they hadn't seen that either as a title company. So, I guess we're just going to educate. So I guess that's what we're going to be doing. Let's see if I can share the screen. I can. And here we go. Day 2. If you guys recall, we finished up kind of through this whole situation about the inspector selection and the inspection deadlines. We touched a little bit on that. Right now, guys, it is just so imperative that the inspection, there's now a new form with that as well for inspectors. I would definitely be giving that to your clients because right now those inspectors, let's see what that form number, I didn't pull it down. MR 2316, we touched on it a little bit last week. I just think that that's such a good form to provide to your buyer when you go in the inspections about saying, hey, these are what the inspector is supposed to do for you. It made me think a lot. We have certain requirements in terms of compliance. And sometimes I fear that just because those are the only requirements, that we don't use all the tools that we have available to us as a, for your own business, not KW, but for your own business. Because remember, at the end of the day, if something goes south on your deal, all of a sudden, they're coming at you. And if you've utilized some of these forms that can help you, they certainly have a hard time arguing it. For example, like a walkthrough form. Yeah, you signed it. Okay. So just heads up, if you have the opportunity and you're going through the inspections, make sure that you do that. I always like starting this one off because so often, because there's a blank there, brokers immediately feel that they have to put a date in there. Okay. And they really haven't read I. And if you have a deadline date in there, that's if the seller is responsible of ordering a document for you. Okay. So let's say hypothetically that there was an inspection report that they were going to provide for you. They did it, and ahead of time as a pre-inspection. That's when you would put the date in there. It isn't a matter of you putting a date in there unless they have a report for you. And I see it so often that people are saying, okay, delivery deadline, inspection reports and or documents to be delivered no later than 10 days or 20 days of that. Now, you could argue the fact that there are documents that they could be given you, like the survey or things like that, but you have another place for that. So unless they are giving you something specific relating to the inspections, that first line shouldn't be filled in unless they are providing it as the seller. Where it does come into play is the objection deadline. Buyer's objection to be delivered to 15 days, in this case, of acceptance. And I put in there red, buyer has only 15 days to get inspections and objection done. And you've got to be realistic with it. This is when you, although you communicate and send to your buyer maybe 3 names for them to select an inspector, it's always good to keep your ear to the ground with the inspectors that you are working with and say, hey, can you guys get it done in 15 days? Because you put a purchase agreement in there and says it's got to be done in 15 days. That's the objection deadline. It's got to all be there. So in truth, buyer has only 15 days to get inspection and objections done. Well, maybe the inspector can only do it 20 days out. So why not already reflect it as such in your purchase agreement? Give yourself breathing room in it. I know that when I was in practice, one of the first people that I was calling immediately after the fact was my inspector. You got to get out there and get this thing done, because the more time I had, the better time I had to work with my buyer on it. Resolution date, in this case, not a hard date. I have 18 days of acceptance. And so basically what that means, acceptance means of the contract. So in truth, the seller only has 3 days from the delivery day to respond, okay? So if you wait the 15 days to get it out, then they have 3 more days, there's your 18 days. So be careful with that one, okay? The waivers, of course, we see that all the time. I really, at this point, partly because of the property, I discourage it. I mean, the seller, of course, has the final decision on that. But in truth, you probably really want to get an inspection regardless. A lot of the deals that we see are falling apart or coming back to haunt us later, or because the inspection wasn't done to its entire amount. Again, I go back to you guys, really spend some time with your buyer when they're doing that. Explain to them all those kind of inspections. And if you use that home inspection licensing report 2316, it outlines a lot of that stuff. Okay. This is the fun one. Objection resolution and termination, because this is where it all falls apart, right? You can see there that when you really get into that, we all know kind of how this works. You go out with your inspector, they go out with the inspector, they see everything from the little switch plate that has a crack in it to maybe the foundation or the roof, whatever. That's the opportunity to educate your people and saying, okay, we've got problems here. What do you want me to object for you? And again, it's a little bit of your own bedside manner, because you got to kind of slowly explain to them, you know what, guys, we're not going to object for every light plate that is, cracked on the wall. We should be looking for things that are of substantial cost to repair. We should be looking for things that are of hazard or, health-wise, that isn't safe. But the little things in there, you're not buying a brand new house. You're not buying a brand new car at CarMax, right? So that, even though it has a lot of lipstick on it, what you're looking for, that inspector, is to give you, it gives you the items that will be a problem for your people. A lot of times they'll ask me, well, why did the inspector pick this, this, and this, and this? These things aren't really of importance. Well, what the inspector has done is given you somewhat of a baseline, because you're not buying a new house. These are things that you're going to need. If they turn around and say the roof looks like it has been well maintained, but may need a new roof in a few years. Well, a few years doesn't mean at the time of sale. It means in a few years, 5 years, 10 years, they maintain the roofs. They've kept the parapets in good shape. They've kept the canales in good shape. But this is a baseline for you, Mr. Buyer, so that you know that in a few years, you're going to have to do that. And it's hard to try to justify to a seller that they need a brand new roof because the inspector said in a few years, whatever that is, it's being subjective. Also on the thing, when you do get to the ORW, I highlighted purposely to inspections. If the buyer objects to any item on the inspection, buyer shall produce with his inspection only the sections of this report. Only. So I know that some of you guys have come back and says, God, the seller sent us the whole inspection report. Man, red flag. That's when you say, hey, don't send me the entire inspection report, because if you do, then you've got to be able to disclose all that. We don't want it. All you want is the sections of the report on which the buyer objects, agrees and bases not to send seller the entire inspection report unless requested by the seller in writing. Okay. So, those are the things that the seller should be aware of as well. That you only are going to get the sections of things. Roof has issues, boom. And I've talked to a couple of brokers. I think Linda Gammon made a comment that she had actually talked to one of her inspectors not long ago and showed them some of this language, and he's beginning to reformat his inspection report. So, you're not sending more than the items on that one page. I highly, highly, highly encourage that you guys also consider getting Adobe Acrobat. If, I think on this page, you can see on my right-hand side, you have the ability to go there and redact. And redacting is a very cool thing. I'll show it real quick to you guys. If you redact something, you can just cover it. And there it is. And once you hit the word apply up here, it blacks it out. Let's see if it does it for us. Okay, bear with me. Yeah, there it goes. Okay, did that come through? Could you see that, guys? How I redacted that? So I do recommend that you consider doing that, because it is helpful when you need to do that. Okay, let's keep going. Now I screwed up my screen here. Sorry about that, guys. Kind of screwed up my screen. Okay, so we know that part. We know the second part to this whole situation is going to be what? The next thing is going to happen is that the seller can respond. Based on that, seller may agree to cure the objections as requested, may provide an alternative cure for the buyer's objections, or may refuse to cure buyer's objections. Seller may not terminate, and I underlined that, seller may not terminate this agreement based on the fact that the buyer made objections. We see that all the time, right? Oh my God, they made this terminate, they made these items on there, they wanted this fixed, and this fixed. We're just terminating. No, they just can't say we're terminating. They can say, no, they don't want to fix anything. But in reality, they just can't say they asked for too many things to get fixed. They can say no. Then it goes back into the hands of the buyer, and the buyer can say, okay, we're willing to go ahead and move forward. Or the buyer would have the right of saying, you know what, if they're not going to fix anything, we elect to terminate this agreement. Okay, and receive a refund of the earnest money delivered. That's always the fun one, isn't it? Because we all know what happens is when it terminates, a lot of times the sellers just say, no, I'm not going to return the money. These were unreasonable requests. That's where it gets into the fight. We'll get a little further down the road on that. And the repair completion. In the event the seller agrees to complete any of the repairs prior to closing, seller shall complete the repairs no later than XYZ dates of the settlement. Okay. Everything goes well. Everything's sweet. Inspections, everybody's done the ORW. You're going to get this deal closed. What I've seen a lot though lately, I have to say to you, is a lot of terminations. And I think that's partly, guys, because the properties, unless they're in the very high numbers, what we're putting on the market today, you've heard me talk about risky listings. And, everybody wants to make a living. Everybody wants to get a paycheck. And a lot of brokers are taking on listings that the property may not be in the best of conditions. That doesn't mean there's not a buyer for it. But what it does mean is that you've got to really be on your toes. And you really, if you're on the selling side, really communicate to your people that people have the right to do objections, people have the right to do inspections. All right. So if we do get ourselves in a termination, that's when you're using that wonderful form 5105. Some of you may have seen it. If the buyer elects to terminate this agreement without requesting seller cure and objections, okay, Buyer agrees that they will not send a copy of the document, survey, or inspection report on which the buyer termination agreement is based unless requested by the seller in writing. We went there. If the buyer timely elects to terminate, earnest money, if delivered, shall be refunded to the buyer. That again, if you're on the buying side, you're the buyer's broker here, right? Everything comes down to that timeline. Everything comes down to that calendar. In this day and age, I've seen people now argue the fact, well, they did want to terminate, but they didn't meet their deadlines. So it's on you to make sure that if there's a termination, if you've gone through all the ORWs and all the times have been properly responded to, you've got to keep a good timeline of it. And it goes even as far as I've seen situations that the seller's broker purposely, maybe, don't want to say that, have not opened up maybe the ORW or the response time in a timely fashion. Then when they give it to their seller, they tell their seller, I just got this today. Well, to the seller, wait a minute, the buyer is out of timeline. And no, I'm not going to give back the earnest money. When in truth, I hate to say, the seller's broker did not follow up in a timely manner. Hate to say that, but it does happen. So it's upon you to make sure you're keeping that timeline tight and you've got dates and times that you sent that, because otherwise it can land up in being a dispute. Okay. Termination. I had this conversation today with a seasoned broker who asked the question, when you start going through the contract, there's various times in there saying that the person who is selling the property or buying the property, that, you know, they didn't meet every letter of the law and they were in default. Well, we all know now that even if the seller's default or whatever, whoever the defaulting party, they are basically supposed to be using the default notice, right? That default notice. Let me just, I'm going to jump to it one more time where it says deadline default, right? There it says, in the event the party fails to perform a specific deadline, the non-defaulting party shall provide written notice to the defaulting party of the nature and extent of the deadline default notice in using form 2112. The defaulting party shall have 2 days. So even when you get in a scenario that it's saying that it doesn't matter, whoever's in default, you're supposed to do that. And I want to read this. If this agreement terminates in accordance with the terms of this agreement, the party shall execute MNAR form 5105 termination agreement, and the event earnest money has been delivered to the title company, escrow agent, the party shall execute a MNAR 5105 earnest money consent to distribute that provides for distribution of the earnest money in accordance with the terms of this agreement. What this buyer broker was saying, or what the seller's broker was saying to me this morning, well, the buyer missed all these things. So do we even have to do a distribution? Yes, you do. We're not lawyers. And it states right there, the party shall, that's us. We're going to have to move forward with this earnest money consent, as well as this earnest money dispute on this termination. So there's 2 parts to that. You have the termination agreement that is signed off that yes, everybody's in agreement to terminate, which allows the selling broker to put it back on the market. And then you have the earnest money consent distribution that hopefully everybody's in agreement, but that's where it gets sticky. Because a lot of times we know all of a sudden the seller's saying, buyer, you know, you didn't meet every letter of law of the purchase agreement. We don't think you deserve to have the money back. And believe you me, we're seeing that on a daily basis right now. The biggest conversations I'm having is with people not wanting to either release the money or think that they are in default with the agreement that the buyer should, or the seller should keep the money. It's a mess. And what I've come down to believing is I have to look back at the individual brokers, whichever party is not taking the time to sit down and say, this is not free money. This is money between you and the other party that you're consummating an agreement that you got scratch in the game, whatever you want to call it, that you are going to move money forward. But that does not necessarily mean that automatically, if there's a default on the buyer side, that the seller keeps the money. And I was talking to one of our younger brokers today, and she made the comment, which I took to heart. I'm fearful that a lot of times the buyer's broker, the purchase side, is telling the people, oh, don't worry, you'll get your money back. You'll get your money back. And that's not always the case. And the same thing going to the other side of the seller saying, don't worry, if they default, we're keeping the earnest money. Please do not do that. Please explain to them that this earnest money is not free money up for grabs. And the only people who control it really are the two parties and the title company. I mean, that's what the title company was talking to me about earlier this morning. Title company asking me how this works, because they're the only ones can do the interpleading. And basically they can say, we got this money in our escrow account, because we don't have escrow accounts, and it's a dispute over this money. We're going to turn it over to the magistrate court and they can fight it out. And whatever you do by explaining to these clients of yours, either side, we're not party to the earnest money, because I guarantee you, they're going to try to wrap it around your neck, the company's neck, and unfortunately your QB's neck, to say, hey guys, you guys are all in collusion together and you're not giving me my money back. That's the seller side. Okay. Or the buyer side, excuse me, the buyer side. Okay, that's a fun one. We'll talk more on that, as I can talk on that one for days, because, I got a nice little letter today. I'll just read one line of it to you guys. Individual issuing a thing. Bear with me. I've instructed my Houston attorney to retain a law firm on behalf in the New Mexico to file a lawsuit against the title company, the owner of the property, the name of the owner of the property, Mr. Trujillo of Santa Fe, Keller Williams, and the franchise of Keller Williams, alleging a conspiracy to commit fraud by depriving me, as a senior citizen, significant funds. Not only will I demand my earnest money back, plus interest to be returned, but I seek triple damages, plus attorney fees for all involved that have participated in this fraudulent activity. That's the kind of letters your QB gets. And it comes because I fear that the brokers did not communicate enough that these funds, we have nothing to do with them. It's between buyer, seller, and the title company. Okay, enough of that. That's just one of my orangutans. Let's talk about service provider recommendations. I call this our CYA, because what it basically states in there is, if the broker recommends a builder, a contractor, an escrow company, title company, pest control company, service appraiser, lender, attorneys, accountant, blah, 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 it is the responsibility of the buyer that they acknowledge that it is their decision to hire that entity. Okay. And the broker shall be based solely upon such independent investigations and evaluations. So when all of a sudden you have a deal that goes south on you, and they're saying, well, you recommended the inspector. No, if you explain the contract to them well enough ahead of time and say, you guys understand, I've given you 3 names for inspectors or 3 names for a roofer or 3 names for a contractor, escrow company, whatever it may be, you understand that that is a sole contract between you and them. It's not me. And that's, I know that I sound like Downer Debbie or Debbie Downer here, but the more you explain to your client, the buyer, what they're getting into, then they understand that this is a contract. This isn't just something that you can flippantly say, hey, I'm not going to worry about it. And believe me, a lot of people do. Okay. Further down, home warranty. There are some home warranties that are available. We have some companies through our MSA that are available. You may want to consider this, and it can be ordered either by the buyer or the seller. And, basically within your agreement, it can be paid by either side. It's even can be paid by the broker if the broker chooses to do that. Disclaimer, property is sold in the current condition. And it's not limited to the location or, what it is. It's not limited to the condition, the size, the location of utility lines. That's one that's come up. Location of sewer and water lines, availability of utility services, or possibly extending improvements. Had an issue with an individual that bought the property sight unseen. And they loved it. The broker walked around and, FaceTimed the location. When they got here to go to closing, they went to the house. And right behind the house was this big old power plant that nobody talked to them about. Nobody put it maybe in the disclosure. Okay. So we have another little one. Broker has not investigated, and it is not the responsibility for foregoing aspects of the property among which lot size, acreage, and square footage may be appropriate, but are not warranted as accurate. So another one that we kind of can fall back on and say, that's not my responsibility. Where you get in trouble is when you take that responsibility upon yourself and you're FaceTiming and do that. Man, if you walk in the backyard and you see a power line and you're doing, oh yeah, Mr. Broker buyer or Mr. Buyer, there's a power line that goes across your house. Okay. I wrote a highlight, a buyer and seller acknowledge that broker's only role in this transaction is to provide real estate advice to the broker, respective client and or customer, and real estate information to the parties. There we go, my famous stay in your lane. For all other services, okay, the party shall rely on other professionals. And I'm always amazed when I shake my head, and I hate to say it, talking to one of my brokers, and I hear, oh yeah, I went on top of the roof with the buyer to look at the roof. Really? First of all, you're creating a liability for the seller, because if you fall off that roof, there could be some litigation. Secondly, you're creating yourself a situation of you're now acting as a roofer. And, thirdly, that's why you hire professionals to do that. Stay in your lane. Okay, I got to get a little drink of water, guys. Here we go. Maintenance. Big one that we run into is utilities. Of course, we know that the seller needs to maintain that property in good shape until the actual closing. But if utilities are on as of date of acceptance, seller shall maintain utilities through the possession date. Okay, here's the story. We're going to close a property on December 1st. That was the original closing date. As it turned out, there were some issues with the property. They were going to extend the closing now to the 15th. The problem is that the buyer and the seller had communicated to shut down all the utilities on the 1st of December. Then came the extension. Guess what they forgot to do? Oh, so when the buyer shows up, ready to move in the house and close, the house had gone black because the people didn't live there for 15 days. And now they were scrambling because they were trying to close, they were trying to move in, Now they had to pay a new service fee because they had a startup on that. So those are those little things that are in trouble, they trouble people. But I do like to point this out. It is the buyer's responsibility to arrange to transfer utilities in the buyer's name on possession date. In this case, the seller had already moved away. They had left. Nobody got back to them. The buyer never got back to them on the extension of the date. We had to do a lot of fast dancing to try to help out the seller. But if you're the person who is doing the buyer's side of this, yes, it is true. If the buyer's responsibility to arrange to transfer utilities, okay? So in that case, of the 1st and the 15th, the buyer should have communicated maybe at least through the buyer's broker. Again, we get in trouble because we're representing the buyer. Why, Tom, didn't you tell them to go ahead and extend the date? Oh, I forgot. I forgot is never a very good answer, because that just shows your level of competency. So keep that in mind. If you're on the buyer side and things change, it's your responsibility or the buyer's responsibility, but they're going to go through you to make sure that their utilities are there. Okay, I want to shut some of this down here for a second, just so I can find this. Yeah, here it is. Pre-walkthrough. In this case, I wrote 3 days prior. Be reasonable with your time. People are moving and leaving. I think I've also told you guys of a situation that you want to make sure that if you're doing a walkthrough and there's furniture up against the walls, you're going to be asking the seller's broker, hey, seller's broker, we need that furniture moved up against the wall. Or we want to, the garage is so overloaded, we can't get even to the furnace or whatever. So that's a conversation of staying nice and being friendly to your seller's broker to make sure they do that. And in this case, the reason for that property is to satisfy the buyer that all corrections have been repaired, agreed upon, that they all agreed upon, and that the house is in date of acceptance. They're ready to go. One of the things that they recommend is using MR form 5110. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Here's 5110. And I find it very useful for the purpose of this statement and only the statement. The signature of one buyer on the walkthrough statement binds all buyers. So if hubby comes and he checks it out and he signs, well, he's not only signed for hubby, but he also signed for wifey. Okay. They certainly, and this is another one of those CYAs here. Waiver. I waive. I'll tell you what, I've done a number of waivers in my career. Oh, Tom, we're good with it. If you think it's great, it's good. Did you hear that word? If you think it's good, it's good. Wow. I don't think I'll be doing that anymore. But basically what it says is that the buyer understands, and even though the broker advised a walkthrough, the buyer accepts the responsibility and hereby releases, indemnifies, and holds harmless seller and brokers from liability for any defects that could have been discovered. If you have that one signed, you've just saved everybody's butt. Because after the fact, they're guarantee you, they're going to walk in that house. And even though they waive the right to do their walkthrough, they're going to go, wow, they didn't get this done and this done and this done. Well, you accepted the house in that condition. It's going to land up being legal. The other one that we have is the walkthrough in person or virtually. That's FaceTiming, okay, at approximately time. This is that place here that, it might be you in person or virtually on. It might be you who does that, other buyer's broker, whatever. Then again, they can say, okay, we're good with everything, or they can object. And I found this to be very, very important. The condition of the property has changed or agreed upon repairs have not been completed as follows. This is your time that if they did not And if they promise to get all the windows cleaned and they promise to get it professionally cleaned, or if they promised they were going to take the rug out or they were going to take out the hot tub, whatever, this is the time to write it in there. All right. And I'll jump right from the objections to the amendment. If the parties intend to extend the walkthrough date to allow the sellers additional time to restore the property to its original location or complete repairs, the party should execute an amendment to the purchase agreement. That's the time to do it, not after. Jumping back, notice to cure, since the condition of the property has changed or the repairs have not been completed by the walkthrough date, seller in default of the purchase agreement, the statement serves as a 2-day notice to cure as required by the purchase agreement. So that's the only other time that you can check that off. So you got 2 days. This is serving 2 days. Then it becomes that real hard question. Well, do we really want to close or do we want to extend it an extra couple days to make sure they get it done? And of course, you know, when you're sitting on the buyer side, well, all our furniture is coming in from Florida, should be arriving tonight. Can we put the stuff out there anyway? No, you don't have possession. So the real key I have found over the years, I've always tried to stay in very good graces and good relations with the selling side. So even though my walkthrough was 3 days before, I normally contact the seller's broker and say, hey, you know what? I'd kind of like to bop in over there to see how they're coming along. Why don't you and I meet at the house? If you have a good relationship and say, you know, I'll buy you a beer afterwards. Try to meet that seller's broker 5 days in front of that closing, because he's going to go in there and go, oh man, we're not even close. And say, well, you know, you're going to have to stay behind. I'm going to go get my own beer, because you're going to have to communicate to your sellers. They got to get this thing lined up and cleaned up beforehand. And I know we all get busy, and this is where I see we have breakdown, is that we don't take enough. Once we get the deal done, you know, in our heads, we're going, okay, it's all done. We're going to closing, you know. I love asking you guys at 3 o'clock, who's has the closing? And everybody says, oh, I've got one next week. I've got one in 3 days, 4 days, whatever it is. I think my next question to that, when people say that, is, okay, have you been in touch with your seller to see how they're coming along? Have you been in touch with your lender to see how they're coming along? Because that's where it happens, is in that crunch time, dealing with a big property up north that, you know, they're supposed to close today. Well, guess what? Now the underwriter is going, wait a minute, we think there's a road on this, and we can't give you the green light, lender, to do the money. What? And everybody's up in a panic. Buyers are threatening to walk away because they didn't know about it till now. Every time you do it again in a situation, I tell everybody, breathe, because that's the most important thing that you can do in a transaction, is breathe and keep that breath going into both parties, that they don't just go crazy. And we're seeing a lot of people going crazy. I'm sure it's partly because people haven't, you know, been able to go out on vacation and do the other things, partly because of where we're at in this country today. All right. And this is always the best one. Number 3, satisfaction. Buyer acknowledges the property is in the same condition as of the date of acceptance, reasonable wear and tear accepted, and all agreed repairs and improvements have been completed. That's what you work toward. If we can get that one done, boy, we're winning. Okay, guys, here we go. This is one that starts off, if you recall, and when we're talking about the buyer ordering their fire insurance or their insurance for their house. And this is where it comes back to bite. Risk of loss. Prior to funding date, sellers shall bear the risk of fire or other casualty. So you really want to make sure that you kind of got a little slop going over both sides. Because if something was to happen before the date of closing, and hypothetical, God forbid, the house or some other reason, maybe trees falling, whatever it may be, that the seller has maintained their insurance. There is cures to that. I won't go into real deep here, But even the house caught on fire, maybe the porch caught on fire and the whole house didn't. But as long as the seller has maintained their fire or other casualty insurance, there's ways that you can say, okay, the insurance company is going to get back to us. You might have to extend your closing a little longer, and you might even be able to close if the insurance of the seller says, you know what, it happened on their clock. We're going to go back and totally rebuild or repair the damage that happened with the small fire that happened in the porch area. So there's a way. I won't go into that too deep. Hopefully you don't get in there. Read the contract. It basically tells you what happens. Assignments, as we know, can be done electronically. That's not a problem. Assignments. People ask me this question all the time. What does that really mean? Buyer may or may not sell or assign or transfer the rights, buyer's rights or obligation under this agreement. When it may, on occasion, it will be checked may. That's probably not the norm, but an exception. May assign is for the buyer who may be looking at changing it to a trust. So it still may be Thomas P. and M. Leonora Trujillo buying the property, but I may be in the process of doing a living trust, which by the time closing comes, I'm actually going to be Thomas P. and M. Leonora Trujillo living trust. Yes, I'll still be the signatory, but I want my paperwork to be doing. That's one way. Or it may be in an LLC, whatever it may. So you have the right to ask as the buyer's agent, okay, what is that? What you guys signed off May? Are you planning to change this before closing? What are you doing? 9 times out of 10, the other brokers are, oh, I don't know. And I just always did it that way. Well, find out what it is. Don't just assume, okay? Otherwise, it may not. In other words, the way it's going to go down is it's going to say Thomas P. and Emily and Trujillo, end of story. I do put in there the heirs and assigns because we just recently had this with a broker here in our office. They were ready to close, and literally the day before they were going to close, the new buyer died. Does the contract die? No. Heirs and assigns. The agreement shall apply to, be binding upon, and enforceable against the inured, which means the ongoing party, to the benefit of the parties hereto and their respective representatives, successors, permitted assigns, heirs, and estates. So an example would be, God forbid, right now, if my mom passed away and she was in the process of selling her house, well, it would fall on my brother and I. The contract's still live. Now, in this case, the heir says we're not moving to Santa Fe, and they are now going through the process of termination. A very good possibility that the seller may say, well, it's no fault of mine that this individual passed away. We're keeping the earnest money. That's probably going to be the easiest solution out of it. Okay. So here we go. We're going to go down through definitions. I'm not going to beat you guys up on all of these because it's very easy to read what all the definitions of the purchase agreement means until we get down here to default, because once again, there's that number 37, the default notice and opportunity to cure. We've gone through it. I actually had a separate page on it. Tells you about the 2-day notice. So anytime there's a default, regardless which side you're on. So if you're on the buyer side and there was a document that was supposed to be given to you and it hasn't come, that's when you do that default notice. You're putting them on notice right then and there. You got 2 days, seller's broker, to get this to us. All right. Attorney fees and cost. This is something people should keep in mind. If you do go to litigation, let's say even over earnest money, attorney fees and costs, should any aspect of this agreement result in arbitration or litigation, the prevailing party of such action shall be entitled to an award of reasonable attorney fees and court costs. So if you're fighting over earnest money and it turns out that you're on the seller side and you're fighting over earnest money and it goes in favor of the buyer, you also could be hooked at paying their attorney fees. Consequently, the same way, if for some reason the buyer defaulted, even on earnest money, and it could be for numerous things. At the end of the day, maybe they were fraudulent on explaining to their lender. This is what I'm hearing these days, that, oh, wow, yeah, and then all of a sudden the lender says, no, man, we just discovered this about you, and you had all these liens against you, and we can't give you the money. Well, the seller could argue that the information that was provided in the pre-qualification letter was not truthful, maybe even fraudulent. Maybe they have the right to do it. And if there's a big suit on that, well, the buyer, aside from not getting their money back, they could also be stuck with having to pay attorney fees. All right. Multiple buyers, we know this one, right? Same thing. Each buyer to this agreement is jointly and severably liable for the obligations of this agreement. So you'll see sometimes on occasion, people are wanting to buy a vacation home here in Santa Fe, and they decide, hey, let's all get together and buy it. And there's 4 people on the signatures who are going to buy the thing. And then all of a sudden, one of them dies or something. Guess what? The remaining buyers are still on the hook. Okay. This is kind of the most recent one here. Force majeure. I remember scratching my head. What does that really mean? And there's some changes in it. Force majeure means hurricanes, floods, extreme weather, earthquakes, fires, or other acts of God. We're all watching what's going on in Kansas. I'm sure there were properties there for sale. I'm sure that there probably were closing coming. And guess what? They just had themselves a tornado. That's an act of God. Okay. I always have my heart out every time I see a natural disaster. The first people I think about is the brokers. I know that there's a lot of people hurt. People may have died, but I also think of our fellow brokers because they're just out of a job, because all the stuff that they may have had on the market or ready to close. Guess what? KW has always been real good about supporting that. I'm sure we'll see that again. So, I always take a few bucks out of my pocket and try to send it to the KW there in Kansas or Tennessee or wherever. It's a good thing to do. There's another one that they just recently put in here. As it says here, other acts of God, unusual transportation delays, war, insurrections, acts of terrorism, and pandemics. So now it is considered a reality, the pandemic, we're dealing with it right now, that is considered force majeure. However, you need to read on, or diseases or other governmental authority taken in response to the pandemic. All time periods, including closings dates, will be extended up to 10 days after the force majeure no longer prevents performance under this agreement. Okay, so we're riding that wave quite a bit, as you guys know, because at one day it's okay, we got issues. Next day you can go out, just wear a mask, move forward. Even in such a sad case of Kansas, that there was a tornado that wiped out everything. So, for 10 days, nothing's going to be happening. But if you happen to have that house that was under contract down the street that did not get touched by that tornado, it's still a viable agreement. Hard to say it to you guys, but it's still a viable agreement. Okay. If the such force majeure continues to prevent performance under this agreement more than 30 days beyond the settlement date, then either party may terminate. So going back to that example, if you can't close because the title house, the lenders, everybody's blown away, and it extends more than 30 days, then you have some recourse on it. But I just found that force majeure has changed a lot from the days of it just simply saying act of God. It gives you more of a definition. Significance of initials all the way through the contract. You can see I always, since it's our side, being the buyer side, I highlight it. Initials are everything, because why? It really means that the initials signify that the buyer or seller have reviewed and understand the page of the section. Initials do not signify acceptance of the terms of this page. Okay, that's the difference. It just means they reviewed it. I look at it as your QB, that you've gone over this page with them, that you've explained to them what termination means. You've explained to them what force majeure means. So when they initial that as your QB, that's given me heads up that you guys have explained all these issues to them. When I get a phone call and saying, guess what, we didn't understand. Well, wait a minute, you initial the page. Oh yeah, we got it through .loop, or we got it through DocuSign. And so-and-so just saying, we just followed all the instructions on the electronic signature. Wow. Now I got a problem. I normally have a problem talking to that broker saying, did you just send it to them? Did you sit down and say, I'm going to send this to you maybe as a PDF ahead of time, and we're going to go ahead and talk about this, and you can ask me questions relating to all these issues? If a purchase agreement is sent out and it's done less than 30 minutes explaining to your client, you haven't done a good job. That's just my personal belief. I'm a big one still that whenever I can do a wet signature, I do it. And I normally tell my clients, hey, be prepared. We're going to go through this purchase agreement and other following docs, and you need to set aside a good hour and a half to 2 hours so I can explain everything to you on this agreement. And knock on wood, I've never been accused or have been written up or have had to defend any issues on any properties I've ever sold. Now, I'm defending a lot of brokers in my office here, and all it does is tell me that apparently they didn't explain the contract very well. Acceptance. Buyer once fully executed and delivered, the parties have legally binding contract, have a legally binding contract. I highlighted that and underlined it because that is one of the things to communicate to your buyer. This is a legal binding contract, can only be broken through litigation or agreement. But it is a contract. It isn't so flip it, something that you're going to buy and say, oh, I'm not going to worry about it, because there's ramifications. But hopefully, if I've done my job correctly and you are excited about buying this house, we're going to go through this thing. It's going to be such a smooth transaction because I've explained everything to you so well that you're going to be living in your dream home in Santa Fe or wherever very, very soon. Last few things. Expiration date. The offer shall expire unless accepted and delivered to buyer's broker on or before. I like to do it before the end of the day. That gives me a little breathing room. I see a lot of people doing it 4, 6 o'clock. It's nice if you can get a deal done before the end of the day. Attention to the buyers and sellers. Okay. The parties should be cognizant of this, and when setting deadlines for inspection and repairs, they got to make sure that they understand that. More importantly, this is our another final CYA. The obligations, responsibilities set forth in this purchase agreement are not those of the parties to the purchase agreement and not to the brokers. Are those of the parties to this purchase agreement and not of the brokers. So Mr. Buyer, Mr. Seller, this is your agreement. I'm just the broker, the transaction broker to get this transaction done. But in all truth, this is agreement between you two. I am the vehicle to get it done for you as the other broker on the selling side. We will do the communications between each other. And I highly advise, Mr. Buyer, that any questions that you have, ask me so I can ask the seller's broker to ask the seller. Whatever you do, try to stay away from the fact of the seller and the buyer communicating to each other directly. It's nothing but a recipe for disaster. I've seen it in the almost 3 years that I've been sitting in the chairs. Most of the time the breakdown happens is when both the buyer broker and the seller broker say, it's okay, let them talk to each other. Trouble happens. Last thing, of course, is the wire fraud. You can read this, explain it to them. It's important they understand it. And of course, if the world's perfect, you're going to get their signature, again, the buyer signatures, and also explain to them at that point Mr. Buyer, this is what's going to happen. Don't just stop with, oh, great, you got your sign. We're going to send it to the listing broker. Go on to the last few pages. Mr. Buyer, this is what's going to happen. If everything is perfect, they're going to accept the offer and they're going to sign it with your purchase agreement. Say, yes, we're in agreement with it. We're in agreement with the price. We're in agreement with the inspection, blah, blah, blah. Or you might get a counter offer, Mr. Buyer. And this is what the counter offer is. They're basically going to say, hey, you know what? We kind of like your offer, but we do have a couple of issues we want to counter back. And lastly, there is an opportunity, there is a time that the seller will just rejects and submits a notification or may have notification of multiple offers. So we're going to be competing. Or lastly, they may say, you know what? Seller is rejecting this offer. Seller should not sign this agreement and does not need initial any and all pages, but should initial below. If you get a rejection, that's all they need to do. Okay. And lastly, yay. This is the thing I'm most excited about. They put the index page where the index page belongs now. It's at the end of the purchase agreement rather than on the top. Okay, so how confused is everybody today? I'll stop the share. Everybody get it? Yeah? Question, somebody had a question. They said they had a question on even yesterday or last week.
Christine has a question, looks like. She's typing.
Okay. Who has a question?
Christine, looks like.
Is it in the chat?
She started to type it. Or I missed it.
Christina, what's your question? Do we have a Christina?
Christine Maroney.
Christine.
Rudos.
Okay, Christine. Do you have a question? You want to turn your mic on?
Maybe not.
No? Did she put it in the chat room, Ted?
Started to type.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom. That was really informative every time.
Okay, good. You know, guys, it's not much different than the previous purchase agreement. It's just kind of readjusted a little bit. It's kind of moved around. There's a few more things, and the default is probably the big one. And you know, I look at you guys, and most of you guys are the same people who get on the 3 o'clock. I so admire that, not because I want you to be listening to me all the time, but all I'm trying to do is pass on my 30 plus years of doing this stuff. And I guarantee you, in the last 6 months, it has been really difficult because more and more people are fighting for that earnest money. Try to stay out of that loop as much as you can, and it's by educating them. And I've got at least 4 or 5 contracts here of people fighting over earnest money. And I don't want it to turn into a big E&O case. It's, you know, I fought that off. And in the 3 years I've been here, I've been able to settle big cases for very little damage to the company and very little damage to the broker. And, you know, I'm not going to be here forever. That's not meaning a threat to everybody, but, you know, at some point in my life, I'm going to move on. And I sincerely meant that in the 30 plus years of me selling real estate, I've been blessed that I haven't ever had any kind of action brought against me. Doesn't mean that it can't happen in the future. But I think a lot of it came from just taking the time to be a teacher to your clients. They love that. You know, when you become that teacher and that mentor to them, say, you know, I'm really going to explain this contract to you. This is really what's going on. The ones I see in trouble are the ones who are being, you know, in a hurry, just trying to get the deal done and not paying attention to crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So if you just take your time and read the stuff and, you know, watch my videos, I'll put this one in last week's up, hopefully today or tomorrow. So you have a place to go. download yourself a purchase agreement from instinet.loop or DocuSign. And, go over it again, because you're going to have that opportunity and you're going to find somebody who says, hey, we want to buy this house. Cool. That's what it's all about. We'll start probably, maybe not next week, right? Let's see, Ted, we're on the, today's the, what the day? Today's 14th.
14th, yeah,
Probably,
23rd.
probably not until the 4th when we'll come back and start the listening agreement. We'll double check and see what other forms are coming up that we need to do. Right now, you can look at the listening agreement. I don't think it's too far off. And you guys know, you can always go to my website, Tom Trujillo Real Estate, Trujillo spelled correctly, TomTrujilloRealEstate.com. And if you go to Tom's QB Corner, there's all these videos of these classes that we've been doing for the last almost 3 years. And hopefully they'll help. Okay.
Also
Very
in,
cool.
also in the calendar invitations.
Perfect. Okay, guys, love seeing you guys. Hopefully see you at 3 o'clock, and we'll keep it going. Write a good contract. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.